Welcome back. We are in chapter 4. We're going to be looking at verses 21 through 28 today. But before we jump in, last week we were talking about in chapter 4, verses 8 through 20, we were talking about how Paul was getting emotional here and how he had really lost influence. We kind of got on a leadership talk there for a little bit and how he had lost influence and he was really kind of asking the question why, almost making himself vulnerable.
Yeah.
And there was a different feeling in that passage than the rest of the book. If you go forward from there or even backwards from there, it was just different.
Yeah, it was almost like this real personal moment for him where we talked about that a little bit. Paul isn't really an emotional writer in most places in Scripture. So to have him just take a moment and express personally that he was almost just kind of feeling lost as to why they were acting the way they were acting said something.
It was almost out of normal character for him.
Yeah.
But he made himself vulnerable and he said, look, you guys believed me before and now you don't. It doesn't make any sense. And then it's almost like he immediately jumps back on the bandwagon and starts laying out truth again. And that brings us to what we're going to talk about today, which is kind of interesting because in chapter 3, we talked about the covenant of Abraham and all of that. And then chapter 4, he really doesn't mention it anymore. And then all of a sudden,
we're back to it.
We're back to it at the end of chapter 4 here. And so we're going to get into it and even get into some real symbolism and some stuff like that. So with all that said, let me just go ahead and read it and we'll jump in. How's that sound?
Let's go.
So in verse 21 it says, Tell me you who desire to be under the law. And again, this was the whole issue. Do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through the promise. Now this may be interpreted as allegorically, these women, two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. It sounds like a bunch of craziness, don't it? But I'm going to go ahead and read it. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and she corresponds to the present Jerusalem. For she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, Rejoice, O barren one, who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate, one will be more than those of the one who has a husband. And in verse 28 it says, Now you brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as at that time he was born according to the flesh, persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit. So also it is now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. Tell us what all that means real quick.
Yeah, that
in about a minute.
Mouthful.
In about 30 seconds. What in the world?
Where do we need to go first?
I know, yeah. So
probably backwards a little bit.
We do. So, if you look back in Genesis, if you're watching this, I mean, if you're really trying to dig into it, you really have to look back in the book of Genesis and know the story that Paul is referring to here. And so that's what you're talking about. So where does all that start? Probably Genesis 16.
About Genesis 16, where we're talking about these two women. One, Abram's wife, Sarah. Sarai at the time, they both get a name change through the thing. Then Hagar, who is really Sarah's
slave.
And so each one end up having a child from Abraham, which we won't get into the theology and all of that. But these two women are now being presented by Paul as an allegory, which we were talking about that a little bit, like what an allegory is.
And I think that's what gets confusing. These terms we don't really use, and even he says this present Jerusalem. He's talking about the condition they're in right now. He's talking about this conflict. He's talking about this issue of grace and this issue of that there's this divide that has happened among all Jewish people. Either you choose this is the Messiah or it wasn't, and they're trying to figure all that out. And so he uses this example to kind of lay out these two truths and to lay out okay, the flesh equals Hagar and that descendant, which is Ishmael or whatever his name was, and then the promise, which is Abraham's promise, is the story of Isaac, which is the promise that we referred to several weeks ago, that was for all of mankind, not just the Jews but the Gentiles as well. And so he's including everybody here. He says, now you brothers, in verse 28, like Isaac, and we're going to be all over the place, I think, are children of promise. We're all children of this promise. So it gets confusing because we don't always know the stories. We were talking about that earlier. We focus a lot on the New Testament. And so when we're reading through Galatians chapter 4 and we get to verse 21, not only is it kind of difficult to read, it doesn't flow well, it's not familiar to most of us. So as we read through it, it's like, what is he talking about?
Right.
But when you know the story, it starts to make sense.
Yeah, we talk about the biblical parables.
Right.
There's stories that we're using, or examples we're using to teach somebody something, and talk about how Jesus might have using John 15, like the whole analogy of a vine. Well, he might have been standing next to a vine and been like,
just for that purpose,
like a vine, and then described it. It's just a device that's being used to try to drive it home, and it's familiar. It's not as familiar to us, to your point. It's not as familiar because we didn't grow up Jewish, and we didn't grow up with all of the stories of the Old Testament being quite as prevalent in our lives. This would have been very familiar to the reader.
That's right. To the people he's writing to, this was a very familiar story. They wouldn't look at it and go, what is he talking about? It would be the opposite.
Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So this was a fleshly covenant, and this was a promise from God. Oh, that makes sense. So the law is fleshly, and the promise from Abraham is the Messiah, and it's where we are now. It's where it's finally coming to pass, and it all makes sense. And so they would see it totally different. But I think it's worth just telling the story just a little bit, and we kind of hit into it a little bit. If you go back and read Genesis 16 probably through the 21st chapter, is that what we looked at?
Yeah.
21st, maybe even some of chapter 22. But if you go back and look at those, you'll see this example, especially 21 verses 9 and 10, chapter 21 verse 9 and 10, where this is kind of wrapped up, and Paul starts referring to how they got rid of Hagar,
right.
they got rid of Ishmael, and he's referring to the law the same way.
Right. God promises to make a nation of Abraham, right? And so Abraham's getting up in years, and he and Sarah are married, and she's kind of past the childbearing days, and they get to a place where, I don't know, basically through lack of faith, it's suggested that, well, maybe God meant for you to have a child. Maybe it's just not by Sarah. Maybe it'd be by my servant lady.
Which is kind of the way they did surrogate.
Right. And so now this surrogate, has Ishmael, who's not really mentioned by name here.
Right.
And then, as it turns out, that's not really what God meant. God actually meant that Abraham and Sarah were going to have a child, and he's faithful to his promise. And Genesis 22 is kind of the culmination of all that, where we really see Abraham in faith. I'm about to sacrifice Isaac, but God making a way and really kind of galvanizing that faith relationship with him and Abraham.
Another beautiful picture of the gospel.
Beautiful picture of the gospel.
Right.
That story predicates all of this, because you have to have an understanding of Abraham, and then his wife Sarah, and then the servant woman Hagar, their children Isaac and Ishmael, their dispositions, how one was kind of the child of the promise, one's the child of what would end up being slavery, that he ends up being cast out with his mom.
Right.
And, it's shown that through her plea that he ends up basically, God kind of has mercy on him, but he ends up being really kind of an adversary to Israel.
Exactly.
This is the same thing we see even in Jerusalem today, the same conflict of these two groups. But
what's interesting here is he uses these parallels to lay out the theme throughout all of the book of Galatians, and that is the law. You don't put all your faith in the law.
Yeah.
He's saying, and so in this case, he's saying, look at this story. This represents the law, and this represents the promise of the Messiah, of faith, of children of God, that we all can become children of God. The way God made that happen is through his son, Jesus Christ. And so, and he uses this example because it was a miracle that she became pregnant. It was a promise fulfilled. It wasn't a fleshly fulfillment. And they even used that, and he talks about how God did that pregnancy versus, Moses made this other one happen. And it was kind of interesting because Sarah's really the one that set up that whole thing and said, y'all go do this.
Yeah. You got, I'm kind of glancing down at your notebook there, but you've kind of written into two columns, kind of isolating. So you got Hagar and Ishmael.
Right.
You've written down some things there, and you got Sarah and Isaac. You've written down some things there. So I want you to kind of hit those right quick.
Okay.
I know we're getting close.
Yeah. So Hagar, I wrote these things. You got Ishmael, Sarah had Isaac, Hagar had flesh. That if we look at this, Paul refers to them as flesh, Sarah as promise. Covenant of Moses, Hagar had the covenant of Moses versus the covenant of Abraham with Sarah. And these parallels are all there. Hagar would represent slavery versus Sarah representing freedom. And Hagar would represent the law of Moses versus Sarah representing the promise of Abraham.
Yeah.
And these things are all laid out right here.
Yeah, and so that visually, I'm looking at that, I'm going, okay, on Hagar's side, flesh, the covenant of Moses, which is the law that Paul's talking about in the overarching theme of Galatians.
Right.
Slavery. And then I look over on Sarah's column, and it's promise, the covenant of Abraham, which we've talked about how this is like this overarching covenant. It's also a
that
theme
includes the
that we cover,
Gentiles. Yeah.
right? And then freedom. And then he also hits here kind of the Jerusalem now, the present Jerusalem, and
Right.
then he hits the Jerusalem above. And it's interesting how
that I didn't even write those.
Hagar's like flesh and slavery, like it's very earthy.
Yes.
The law is like this fleshly thing. It's very tethered to the here and now. Whereas the Jerusalem above is almost referring to something that's,
Eternal.
eternal. Right. That's a great word. And you can't help but just kind of draw those two parallels. So
I need to add to my list, man.
There it is. Paul needs.
Yeah, that's good.
Paul's trying to point them towards the eternal,
Mm-hmm.
and that through faith, not by keeping the individual little tenets of the law, which are just all they're really worth at the end of the day, is just the flesh.
It's just
Without
the flesh.
faith, that stuff means nothing.
Well, he kind of wraps it all up in these last two verses. He says, cast out the slave woman. If you look in chapter 21, verse 10 or so, That's exactly what happens.
Yeah.
Verse 9 of Genesis chapter 21, there's that whole laughter thing we were talking about, where Ishmael was laughing, and he was a teenager at this point, probably 12 or 13 years old, and Isaac was just a toddler. You know, he was maybe, and apparently he mocked him or laughed at him or something, and Sarah didn't like it. So that was the end of the whole family. They're out. So she's meeting with Abraham saying, get them out. Mm-hmm. Paul uses that to say, let's get the law out. Let's remove the power that the law has had over us for so long. And it makes more sense as you get into chapter 5, where he goes into circumcision and all of that. It's not so much the law that was the problem. It was the power that the law had over the people. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so at least that's what I get out of it. It's like the law is not necessarily bad. It's that it's replacing grace, and it's replacing the promise. Mm-hmm. And so, but he uses these strong terms again. Cast out the slave woman. Again, the law, or that covenant of Moses, it's almost all of these things refer to the same thing, as he's using this kind of as a parable, or paralleling it all together. He says, cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. The promise is different. So brothers, we are not children of slaves, but of the free woman. Grace is totally different.
Yeah, and this is a lot to keep up with, y'all. This, if you read this passage,
and I know we went over today, but I don't know how we could do it.
Yeah, this is just it's thick, and so best advice: slow down and read it a couple of times, and then go back and read Genesis. It'll help.
I think it will. I think you can't really get this unless you go back and read Genesis. So today is going to take some time to really understand it and get into it. You got to go back and dig a little deeper and understand what is happening in Genesis chapter 16 through 20, really through chapter 22, at least to the end of chapter 21, and chapter 22 gets into a whole other good picture and also stuff. But anyway, we thank you guys for joining us today. Do you have anything else? Real quick, because we were way over.
We're way over. If you've made it this far, congratulations.
Exactly. Thank you. And if you do like this content, hit the like button and also subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We'll see you later.